Your Fulbright Scholarship took you to Wyoming as a visiting professor for 12 months. And just as a bit of background on Wyoming, it's a historically red state, arguably the most solidly Republican state in the United States. They haven't actually voted in a Democrat since Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. But they weren't actually all in for Trump from the beginning. Back in the 2016 Republican primary, he was actually well behind both Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. Nevertheless, he won Wyoming by, I think, the largest margin of victory of any presidential candidate in history. So can you talk a little bit about your experience as a political commentator and professor coming from a politically cosmopolitan city of such as Sydney, teaching and researching in Wyoming?
Yeah, look, as someone based in Sydney with quite progressive views, going to Wyoming was a really fascinating opportunity, and it was the sort of the conservative, deep red nature of the state that was one of the reasons I was attracted to it, because I wanted to understand the complexities of the contemporary Republican voter in the US. And I think what happens is a lot of the news that we get, a lot of the news cycle comes from either Washington or New York or LA, and that makes sense. And we don't hear the stories of, I suppose, we don't hear the more sort of, I suppose, subtle stories of what people are thinking. And so, so Wyoming is it's a very small, like big state by land, but a very small state, only about 650,000 people. And it's a really complex place, because I think historically what we've done is we've identified, or there's been a tendency for much of the mainstream media to classify, say, Trump supporters in a very one-dimensional way. The term deplorables was used based on one of Hillary Clinton's speeches. But there's actually a lot of layers about why people are voting that way, and so I was really interested in to dig in. What I found on my visit there, both as a educator and a researcher, was an incredibly generous population, a population who were really open to discussing things. Rarely did I find any kind of sense of people being, I suppose, dogmatic in their perspectives. It was much more of a sort of I suppose, a two-way discussion. Laramie, where I was based, where the university is based, is probably the sort of the blue outpost in the sea of red. It is that section is quite pro-Democrat, but the rest of the state does tend to, or most of the rest of the state does tend to vote Republican. And my conversations were always respectful, they were insightful, and I gained some pretty amazing insights to the population, and sort of the voting patterns that people are following.
So from these experiences and your conversations, what did you find were the main factors that tend to drive Wyomingites towards the Republican Party as opposed to the Democrat?
Yeah, look, I think there are factors that traditionally drive or make the Republican Party quite appealing, and then there are, I suppose, the Trump factors, and those two things aren't always the same, right? So I think the first thing is that Wyoming is a conservative state. It has quite quite a strong, a lot of folk there have a really strong Christian connection, and so I suppose a more conservative end of the political spectrum is something that they're attracted to. It is a state that's very much reliant on large extractive industries. The push towards a greener world is economically threatening to people, and people are concerned about their livelihoods. And in America, like in Australia, we've seen the rise of Rust Belt states and whole regions, and there is a fear that by sort of following something like a Green New Deal, that people get left behind. And I think that's really tangible. And I think this is one of the gaps that's existed, is that often the understanding of these areas is that there's a real fear of being left behind. It's not just and people are worried about their families. It's a real human everyday experience. But then the Trump thing is also an interesting one, because there's a couple of additional dimensions to the Trump phenomenon that makes Donald Trump originally sort of repelled by Wyoming, but now much more attractive. by a Wyomingites, so to speak. One is the sense that that sort of a lot of international agreements and decision-making bodies such as the UN and international sort of trade agreements, people feel far removed from that decision-making process. And the fact that the Trump administration came in and said, we're going to rip these things up and we're going to start again, we've got a bad deal. You know, the fact that we're going to be we're going to be masters of our own destiny. We're not going to rely on faceless bureaucrats. That's got a big impact in Wyoming. What you've got to understand is that in Wyoming of 600,000 people, most people, not everyone, but a lot of people can probably pick up the phone and ring the governor's office and speak to the governor himself, right? Because it is quite a small constituency, if you can imagine. So that's one thing that I think was incredibly appealing. The other thing is, and this is a real issue in the US that I think, unless you live there, is that there is a fear that you know, so-called political correctness has gone too far, that people are stifled in what they can say, and so therefore they feel constrained, and they feel that if they say if they say even the right thing in the wrong way, they'll experience a backlash. And so Donald Trump's President Trump's anti kind of political correctness rhetoric, and often even his own language, is often seen as a breath of fresh air in some of these areas. So so I think there's some of the insights I gained. You know, the people I spoke to, you know, look, I'm not saying there wasn't people who had sort of anti-immigration tendencies, or, you know, but a lot of them weren't anti-immigration. But the relationship was very much one based on personal interactions. Decisions were made on personal interactions, not someone's background. And so in a way, it was, it's a very subtle experience in the way that you engage with some of the population. It's how you interact with them which forms their opinion, not on your, say, political views or your background.